I'm Matt Byram, and this is the Marketing Strategies Podcast, where I speak with interesting and well-respected marketers from high-growth companies. We'll discuss the strategies they've used to generate traffic, acquire new users, and grow their business.
I know on day 30 if you are going to renew or churn on day 365.
It's a little bit of mind control.
You need to reach the leads in a specific time frame. The faster, the better.
When something works, don't do more like it, do more with it.
If you're selling to a very finite audience, an inbound model is going to be grossly inefficient.
This audience has what top questions, and then make sure that you have an answer to each of their questions.
We don't hire professional writers to write for the blog. We hire sales operations practitioners.
Whoever gets closest to the customer wins.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Marketing Strategies Podcast. Today I'm joined by Patrick Moran, who is Global Head of Growth Marketing at Spotify. Before working at Spotify, Patrick was Global Head of Marketing and Growth for Yik Yak. He also worked in senior growth positions at TiVo, Netflix, and eBay. I'm super excited about today's episode, as usually the guests on this podcast are from B2B companies. So this is a really great opportunity to understand how some of the world's most disruptive consumer brands have grown and the marketing strategies they've used over the past few years. So let's dive right in. How are you doing today, Patrick?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Matt.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's really nice to have you on this podcast, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Sure. There's nothing like starting your week with a podcast. So it gets me mentally up and running for the week. But I certainly hope that what my insight or my experiences would somehow provide some value to your audience. But yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, with a CV like yours, I'm sure there's a lot of insight that you can give us. And there's nothing like the diving in at the deep end on a Monday morning when this is being recorded. So let's do it. So to start this off, I'd like to dive back to your career at your time at Netflix. And this was 2012 to 2014. And I did a little bit of research, and I found that in 2012, Netflix had approximately, you might tell me more accurately, but 25 million subscribers. And then in 2015, which is just shortly after you left, they had around 70 million. And obviously that is phenomenal growth by anybody's standards. So I was interested just to learn and understand, what was it like working at Netflix during this time of growth?
It was certainly transformative, at least from my end. The thing is, I joined 8 months after Quickster. I'm not sure if most folks remember what happened with Quickster, but Quickster was essentially the separation of the DVD and streaming services that Netflix had, and they looked to sort of divide it up, which happened in 2011, and that caused just a lot of problems with the market, and their customer base didn't seem to respond to it fairly well. And so I think that the market cap of Netflix dropped from, probably around 30 billion to about 20 billion in a matter of a few weeks. So I joined 8 months after that. And then I joined 8 months before House of Cards. And so that period was certainly, pretty interesting, where, we were trying to hire a lot of people and nobody really wanted to come to Netflix. But by the time that I left, everybody had been wanting to come to Netflix, and people still reach out to me today for insights into, how we did it at Netflix. So it was certainly an interesting time. And I think there are a lot of things that Netflix did really well during that period. But if there's anything that I can point to, it's just that I think Reed Hastings and his leadership team essentially picked a strategy and doubled down on it. I think that that's more of what it is than anything else. And that sort of manifests itself not just in the content that Netflix ended up purchasing, but it also came through in a lot of the things that we were doing as an organization, specifically in marketing.
So you say about this strategy and they doubled down on it. Talk to me about that strategy. What was the strategy, and actually, what did they do to actually identify the success and then actually double down on it?
Yeah, I think the strategy was mostly around content. And I remember the saying at the time was, we wanted to be HBO before HBO could be us. And I think a lot of that came down to, okay, well, how are we going to start to differentiate ourselves from all the other platforms that were gaining the same library? Right. And so I think that was where there was this very thorough thought process into potentially experimenting and really getting into what type of content would differentiate us from everybody else. And I think that strategy sort of then lends itself to, okay, well, should we give certain producers and directors a lot of just creative leeway to be able to create the content that they need to create that would essentially become a lot more connected to the Netflix brand. And so we essentially transitioned ourselves from a more of a service and utility company, that was primarily Silicon Valley, into sort of a more global entertainment company that now, right? And it's fascinating the way that the company has transitioned that way.
So it's really focusing on original content, I guess, to actually differentiate yourselves from the competition. So the strategy at that time was focus on product and make yourself different from the competition by creating your own original content.
I mean, in terms of the actual product or service, I think we were, or at least, I think for the most part, Reed was able to see that a lot of other companies were coming into the space, technically speaking, right? So it wasn't that difficult to create a streaming platform and to stream your own content. And then you had to then start to compete with a lot of these other entertainment companies that already had their content, right? And so from that standpoint, I think it just made more sense for the company to start to really think about, okay, well, how do we scale this globally, but at the same time be known for who we are specifically and not just as this library of content that is an aggregate of a lot of other sources.
How much did the marketing team have to do with the actual product team?
The marketing was pretty instrumental, and for a lot of reasons, and it's also where I truly learned sort of the value of the brand or the value of brand work. We really needed to transform ourselves from this more, everyday product, cancel anytime, anywhere, only for $10 a month or only for $9.99 a month, into something more like, that's a service I need to have. That's a service I need to have because of the content that it has. And that's a service that caters to sort of my lifestyle because of the stories that sort of platforms able to tell, compared to anything else, right? So I think from a marketing perspective, there's just a lot of very fundamental changes because we were primarily a performance and PR shop up until then. That doesn't just implicate the marketing capabilities, but that also is now associated to our financial ties to the dollars that we're spending. And it's now sort of then also associated with a lot of other things like creative development and the story that we wanted to tell and things of that nature. So up until then, marketing was mostly sort of centered on very US focused product education and just illustrating a breadth of library. I remember buying so much inventory where there were, we would put in, 10 or 11, 12 pieces of box art on a banner and just expect clicks to come out of it.
Yeah.
Versus, going into true content marketing and really diving into, sort of transforming the perception of that into, that of a global entertainment company.
Talk about banner advertising and content marketing there. It'd be great to dive into that and understand a little bit more about you're building a great product, original content, and doubled down on that strategy where you were creating more and more original content. And you effectively had to tell this story, which was, this is a service you need to have because it's got so many of your great shows on it that you need to be watching. How did you tell that story? And then how did you use different channels and methods such as advertising and content marketing to actually start building that brand from there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we tested a lot of things, right? And I think even stepping back into, well, okay, now we're introducing a lot of quote unquote brand type advertising or brand type marketing. Now, how does that mix up with performance? Even from that standpoint, we were trying to figure things out, right? And so I think there's just a lot of tests to try and figure out sort of the implications of it towards streams, towards our sub growth and things of that nature. Where we would do it not just within the US, but we'd also start to dabble into, well, how does this impact our presence in Europe or in South America? I think for the most part, I think that's primarily where we sort of started. Now, we also ran into a lot of questions at the beginning. Should we be talking about our service or should we be talking primarily about our content? And so I still remember from the beginning where we ran, a lot of these marketing campaigns around cheating, for example, right? And I thought that was actually pretty funny where we would, talk about a couple and, the man would be like, oh, well, be a little bit surprised about the show that he's watching and his partner would would act and pretend that they were surprised, and then at the end of the day, like they realized that she was actually watching ahead of him, or watching ahead with the shows, and then that considered that she was cheating, right? So I think we did a couple of that at the beginning, but slowly realized that with the amount of content that is out there, and with our, I wouldn't say fairly limited budget, but with the budget that we had, we just wanted this sort of veneer of just sophistication and this sort of look of quality content, which is true. And so eventually, I think the company just made the decision to just double down on content. And so at this point, I think anything you see coming out of Netflix will always focus on the content that it has more so than anything else.
And especially if you're spending so much money on creating original content, that's like your gold dust. That's the thing that you want to push, really, isn't it? So I guess that just totally makes sense. And in terms of the channels that you use, what was most successful? What did you find really worked for you in terms of actually getting that content, helping people understand what the new shows were, what they were about, and how they, what the storylines were? How did you get those out, and what were the most effective channels for you?
I think it's really mostly a pretty thorough understanding of how our users were enjoying and using the content and why they were using the product in the first place. And I think that informed a lot of our media strategies, because there was really not one channel that sort of did the heavy lifting over the course of many campaigns. There were campaigns that were a lot more social media focused, right? So BoJack Horseman, I remember, where we launched this GeoCities website that was sort of this sort of pretend website that BoJack Horseman had developed and created, because the character was based off of this 90s has-been comedy sort of actor, right? So I think it really depended on the audiences that we wanted to reach. But for the most part, for me, the question was, what were some of the media channels that surprised me in terms of their impact? And I think radio and print, coming from performance background, sort of surprised me, just because at least radio in the US...
The non-digital channels really were the most successful. Wow, that's impressive. That's interesting.
Well, not necessarily most successful, but they were a lot more impactful than I thought they would be, right? Because I think when you're buying radio, you can buy certain inventory on radio during prime time that's maybe not as expensive, but the reach is there, and you get 100% share of voice and things of that nature, right? And I think a lot of that comes from just, I guess, we also had this sort of very heavy testing background where we weren't afraid to try new channels just because it was fairly new, or, we were given the leeway to try sort of new things or try to use old tactics in new ways. And so I don't know that I can necessarily point to one specific channel, outside of the usual suspects with paid social, paid search, and so on and so forth. But there were channels, depending on the media mix, that were like, oh, I didn't realize that was going to be as impactful as it was.
So do you have a culture of testing then at Netflix, where you would test lots of different channels and effectively see what worked and experiment further from there?
I think it was that, but I think it was mostly under the umbrella of just testing the impact of campaigns within the construct of our entire sort of marketing campaign, right? So there are brand campaigns that have a start and finish, but there's also this sort of more evergreen, always-on layer that is just persistent, right? And so the natural sort of understanding of that is that there is this sort of awareness and consideration aspect of things, and then there is the performance that collects on it. But as you get more sophisticated, or as we got more sophisticated with it, and as it got slightly more complex, we just realized too that to some extent we were also driving word of mouth within our existing user base, and that's also something that's impacting. So we looked at a lot of that. I think one campaign after another, you start to learn, a few things here and there, which is why I guess the first few campaigns, at least for me, were probably the most interesting, just because, that's where we were, just completely getting started. We just didn't know a lot of what we were doing. But, we asked the right questions, and I think for the most part, Kelly, our CMO, and Reed gave us sort of the license to try and figure it out.
It's great to have that leeway, really, isn't it? Nice to be able to just have that flexibility to test and see what works, and then, guide your own route, really. It's a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, and there was one there. Obviously, there's this question around, well, what's the impact of brand? How does that impact performance? And so we got to a point where I remember Reed asking me, he's like, well, what do you think we should do to try and get some signal, better, or a better signal than we've had before? And I said, well, the holiday is pretty heavy for us. Why don't we shut down Canada? And he said, okay, go ahead. And I couldn't believe that he said, okay, go ahead.
Just do it.
Yeah, but that's where we, when we essentially shut down parts of our marketing in Canada and to try and get some sort of signal. And that, it's that mentality, I guess, that, comes back to what I was saying earlier about Netflix and doubling down on a strategy and believing in it, where they weren't necessarily afraid. They weren't afraid to fail, and they weren't afraid to really stick to their guns. So I think that's a big reason of why they've been successful.
And what was the effect of shutting down Canada? What did you learn from that?
We learned the impact of a lot of the above the line, especially TV, and its impact on to streaming and sort of our sub base. We learned that within the context of the holidays, so one of the heavier sort of seasons at Netflix. And it was, it certainly informed a lot of our media strategies going forward and how much we wanted to invest in above the line versus below the line.
Would you actually see people see some advertising and start a Netflix subscription because of that advertising? Was it that direct, or was there other factors in play? Was it a long sales cycle? How did that actually work for you guys?
A lot of it comes back down to a fairly solid understanding of how our users use our product. And I think having an understanding of, okay, well, this is how Netflix fits into the lives of certain people. And that's basically a combination of behavioral data coming from product usage and qualitative data coming from surveys. And I think that, coupled with the behaviors that we saw after we ran TV and measured that against a market where we did not run TV, really informed how we wanted to move forward. And so, to answer your question directly, did we see a lift? Yeah, we saw a lift. And so then the next question is, did we see lift within noise, and how did we normalize for noise? And we essentially normalized for noise, obviously through the course of time and through frequency and things of that nature, but we normalized for noise also by having this sort of fairly thorough understanding of user behavior. So that's kind of how we ended up there.
And was user signups, was that your primary metric, or were you focused a lot on retention or watch time as well? What would be the metrics that you guys were really measured on?
Yeah, I think all the way up until my time at Yik Yak, I was pretty much focused on registration and sign up. And I think my life pretty much revolved around the cost of what we were spending over the value of the users, and then sort of deriving some level of ROI from there. But for the most part, at least on the marketing end, which is not too different from any other sort of more traditional, marketing organization, there was obviously this focus on the brand and its impact on not just, existing users, but not just the impact on non-users, but the impact on existing users, and then performance as a way to drive more signups or more registrations.
That's really interesting. And if we were to fast forward to the present day, you're at Spotify now, obviously an extremely exciting company and, an extremely exciting time as well. However, Spotify, to me, it seems like it's at a slightly different stage of growth than when you were at Netflix when you joined. Spotify seems like a bit of a more mature company. Would that be fair to say?
Well, it certainly matured over the last few years, and especially over the last few months since we've gone public. But it is interesting because I think there's a lot of things that we're still figuring out here that we also were trying to figure out back in 2012 at Netflix. And so it's been fascinating to me, and I've been extremely fortunate to be a part of a company that, one, I truly love using. At least the service, I love using the service. But the other thing, too, is that there are a lot of parallels to, or a lot of similarities to what we were going through at Netflix when I started. So there's a bit of fortune telling, I guess, that I've been sort of a little bit of a part of, and being able to, I guess, kind of slightly predict the challenges that we may be facing. So that's been great, at least from my perspective.
And it still seems that you've got plenty of growth in your pocket from what I can say. I got some numbers. So I'm almost judging you on the time that you joined to the time that you leave companies here again. But up to, when you joined Spotify, there was around 57 million users based on a chart that I've seen in June 2017. And actually January 2018 is the latest stat I got, which is 70 million. So 57 million to 70 million. And obviously, that's still huge growth in percentage terms, especially when you start to take into account the new companies that have come into the market, Apple Music and Amazon and the like. What are you seeing as the main drivers for growth at the moment at Spotify?
The main driver, like anything, is core product value, right? And I think as a result of that, we've found a fairly solid, fit within the market. We don't just find that in Western or English-speaking countries, but we've found that to be true in a lot of countries around the world. I think that's been the core of what's been causing a lot of this growth, right? I think it's just, for the most part, people love music and that's what we're known for. And I think the algorithms and the playlists that we've been able to create are so personalized that, it adds, a certain sort of level of value, I guess, to users that they didn't necessarily have before, right? Or necessarily couldn't find as quickly or as seamlessly before. So I think for the most part, that's kind of what's driven the value of Spotify over the last few years.
So similarly to like the question I asked about Netflix, does Spotify marketing team and the Spotify product team work really closely together? It seems that they're very closely aligned.
It's a good question. And I think that's one of the things that I'm looking to do is establish a pretty close and a lot more of an integrated partnership between the marketing and the product teams. And I think as I transitioned myself from more of an acquisition marketer into sort of this quote unquote growth marketer, I think the success of my role and really the success of what we do within marketing as in large part is very much dependent on its aligned and integrated objectives with our product team, specifically our growth team and then our platforms team. So yeah, I mean, I think we're strong there, but like anything else, the product evolves, the market evolves, and as all of these things evolve, our integration just becomes that much more necessary.
Absolutely. I mean, I did a podcast just the other day, a couple of weeks ago, actually, with a guy called Val from Revolut. And if you haven't heard of them, they're like a challenger bank, particularly in the UK, I think, offering foreign exchange as well. But really, really interesting. And they just actually passed a $1 billion valuation, got $250 million of investment. And he says, he's part of the marketing team. They don't do a lot of marketing. The whole marketing ethos is really focused around building a product that just people love and will recommend to their family and friends and other people, and most of their business is from word of mouth. And I think more and more these days it's like software, apps and pieces of software that we use, apps and software is more and more dominated by a product focus to just make something that people love using, so much so that they go and tell their friends and family. Is that more where you're trying to get to? I mean, you're already kind of there on the product side, but you're trying to align the marketing team further with product internally just to make that even stronger.
It's a great point, right? And I think there's two answers, or at least 2 points that I want to make within the context of what you just said. I think Scott Galloway, in his interview with Harry Swisher on Recode Decode, actually said something to the effect of, gone are the days where you'll feel a lot more patriotic if you drink this beer, or sort of where the advertising will essentially take care of the brand of the product, where now I think product is basically the new black, is I think how he says it. And so you see companies like Uber, and when they started, and Airbnb when they started, or even Instagram and Facebook, where they are able to delineate themselves from advertising and truly have their platform become their marketing arm, right? And I think that's a fairly solid delineation that a lot of companies have now sort of picked up. And I think it's a fairly strong one because you're seeing more and more of that, right? Because the other thing too is that a lot of users will tend to gravitate towards what they trust and what they believe. And, with advertising, I think, users are wary of what they hear a lot. And so they will take advertising within the context of what they truly believe about your brand. Right. And so I think there's that. But I think the second point within Spotify is that that's already happening. So our word of mouth is actually fairly strong. And we're seeing that even in countries that we're not in. So I think that part, for the most part, we are obviously trying to fuel. Right. And I think there are a lot of features and products a lot of features within the product. And as the product evolves, I think we're going to possibly see more of that where, we're looking to fuel a lot more organic growth. On top of, the way that I see marketing is essentially the amplification of that. Right. And I think there's two things. One is the amplification of that, but two, as the space gets so much more crowded with services like Apple Music and Amazon and internationally there's Deezer and Joox and a lot of these other sort of companies, there is going to be this competition to get to the user first. That's sort of where the marketing comes in. But the other thing too, at least on the growth side, is to not just understand how to get to the users first, but to also get the users to experience the value of the product as quickly and as often as possible before they do that with other services, right? And so that's where you start to sort of begin to build the barriers and start to build the loyalty. I think that's where marketing sort of starts to fit in.
Yeah, so people start to feel ingrained within your product, like it's almost a difficulty to leave and try something different, for example.
Yeah, and I think that's what we try to do, having gotten into growth. I mean, it's really defining how users kind of flow in and out of the product, but then layered on top of that, having a fairly solid understanding of the right intervention points, like when to communicate to your users or non-users for that matter, and get them to the service, right? And get them to experience the value of the product. If we can retain users, the better, right?
Absolutely. The less people leaving, the better. We definitely agree there. So in terms of marketing then, new customer acquisition, what's really moving the needle for you at the moment? What are the successful channels and strategies that you're using at Spotify to make the difference and bring new users on board?
Just having a fairly solid understanding of who our existing users are, why they love the product, how they use the product, and then being able to figure out how to best reach audiences who look like those audiences, right? Or best reach audiences who are not users and sort of who look like those existing users, right? And again, that could span sort of many different channels and sort of many different strategies, but I think that fundamental understanding needs to exist.
So you'll profile and segment your user base and perhaps then go out and find people that look like these audiences and market to them in a similar way that you see the patterns of that profile using your service. Is that right?
Yeah. I think having a true understanding of how and why your users use the product is fundamentally important. That informs a lot of things. And one of the things that it informs is how to communicate to people who are not using your service, whether they're non-users or past users.
To actually reach those people, what channels are you finding most effective?
Well, I mean, obviously, organic word of mouth is a pretty large driver, right? But I don't think the answer to that question, at least for Spotify, is really that much different from, I would imagine, any other consumer company, where one, obviously, it depends on the market. And then two, it depends on cost. Three, it depends on audience behavior, right? And so that could be very different for different markets. It could be mostly digital online and sort of brand placements online in one market at a particular point in time, and it could be TV and above the line and radio in other markets at different points in time. If anything, if there's any, I guess I've learned over the last 15 years, there's no silver bullet in a lot of these situations, at least from what I've found.
So it's just a case of, obviously a big consumer brand like Spotify, it's just a case of being in the relevant channels at the right time for the right audiences when people are there. Effectively, when your audience is there, you want to be there too, as does everybody, I suppose. But that sort of is the general marketing strategy.
Yeah. And again, I think it also comes back down to, at least talking about the acquisition side, it comes back also down to, okay, well, what is the true sort of mix between things that are happening all the time? So, just sort of evergreen or performance marketing, how does that mix in with campaigns that have a certain end date? Even that sort of fundamental question is something that we're sort of still trying to answer, and I think we're getting better at it. But that in itself informs, well, sort of what channels and what message and timing and all of these other things too. So.
And you test these different channels effectively to understand the cost of acquiring users in the different channels. I imagine that's a core focus for your team, is to make sure that you're coming in under, the lifetime value of a typical customer.
Yeah, I think, for the most part, I think the testing, or at least the discipline, is certainly there, and we're evolving and getting better at it. And I think one of the things that I've been trying to do is to get a lot more exposure into how the product teams test their initiatives, just because I think they're just a lot more evolved in terms of process and sort of iterations and all these other things. So I guess organizationally, that's also one of the things that we're looking to do. But yes, we're constantly testing new channels. How do we further optimize existing channels through our partnerships with, and with our agency and with these publishers. How does that work when we are looking to optimize globally versus optimizing locally? Then there's obviously a lot of message testing and things of that nature. But yeah, I mean, I think it's something that is ongoing, and I think we'll continue to we will continue to get better, as these tests start to take shape.
And I guess where at Netflix you had the content, the original content that you guys would create, the series, original Netflix series and things. But at Spotify, you can't necessarily market the music in the same way, perhaps. What content are you using to attract new users to the platform and to keep and to retain users, I guess, as well?
We do market our artists and our creators a lot. And I think that's a partnership we have very specifically with the artists that we work with. We also have a lot of our own sort of original content that we market. And then we have the service and the product features that we market as well. Have we gotten to this sort of Netflix answer that we are going to be this one thing? I think we're getting there. I think we've been known for having this massive library, but at the same time, that's now becoming sort of table stakes. On the retention side, I think it's just a matter of now trying to figure out, okay, well, what are the, when are the right points and when are the right sort of points within the user journey to try and get them either back into the service or get them to experience the service in a way that, they need to in order to build this sort of habitual behavior on Spotify. So that's also sort of a mix of content and feature usage.
And I guess, will you build strategies around when to recontact people or when to send people the relevant messages about new content or content that might be of interest, for example, to keep them hooked in? And do you then test the different timeframes or all these different things that might actually determine when people see messages from Spotify?
Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, I think there's really 4 users that we look at a lot more closely than others, I guess. I would say people who aren't using the product, people who are new, people who've left, and people who use our product fairly sporadically. And I think each of those cohorts has its own strategy. And again, it comes back down to, one, an understanding of why they left in the first place, why it doesn't fit, were there expectations that we didn't meet, were there things that we were saying in the acquisition front that they didn't necessarily get the experience once they were on the product. Are there things based off of their cohort that we can better understand that will get them to at least try something new? That's where it becomes a little bit more complicated. But we spend a lot of time trying to figure out a few things. One, what is the best way to communicate to them, to users who've left or who use our products fairly sporadically? There's a lot of different ways to do that. 2, is it economically feasible? And 3, does it work, right? And by does it work, I think it's one thing to bring a user back and increase monthly active usage, but it's another thing to bring them back and actually keep them there. All right. And I think those are 2 very separate things. And for the most part, what we try to at least optimize for is that when they come back, that they actually stay, as opposed to, us propping up short-term metrics just to,
for vanity, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean, versus, trying to sort of game the system, right?
Yeah,
so
for long-term value. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that process automated, or is that something where you'd have your customer success team actually supporting various users to try and bring them back on board? How does that work?
We're still building a lot of that out, right? And I think we're still building the triggers. A lot of the triggers are very much built off of a few things. One is the strength of our internal platforms and what they're capable, what the platforms are capable of doing. But the other thing too is just the intelligence of what we have and then how our users behave. It's one thing to build for global scale, but then it's another thing to start to optimize for local importance, right, or like local value. So we're getting there, and I don't know that we will ever get to a point where everything is automated. But like anything, I think it's like an evolution.
As always, I guess, it's always going to be the way. So I guess if we take this out to a broad scale again, what are the marketing strategies and what are the things that you're going to be focusing on for the next 6 months, the remainder of 2018? What's important for you over the next few weeks and months? What are you focusing on?
Having a fairly strong partnership with our product team I think is very important, especially as we start to really consider the strength of retention and how that impacts our numbers. The other thing that we were talking about is evolving the platforms, right? And evolving sort of the way that we think about how we run experiments, what we want to learn from them and how we want to double down on what we learn. And then I think the third thing is again, another thing that we were talking about, which is, okay, it's one thing to look at the US and the UK and a lot of the Western countries and be able to build things or build sort of marketing activities around those markets. But truly the growth of Spotify is going to come from markets that are outside of that, right? So I think one of the questions that we're looking to face is how do we structure ourselves to get better at that?
Sounds like a good focus, and it certainly sounds like you're going to be busy there as well. In terms of the point 3, we hadn't really discussed all that much. Just a quick question around that. I mean, how do you see that working? Is that a case of actually the growth of the business as people? So you're actually going to set up more different locations to actually build growth in different countries and regions? Is that how that would work? Or is it effectively pushing more marketing in those areas, or I guess a combination?
Yeah, and I think that's why the integration with the product teams and with the other teams at Spotify become that much more important, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is you're trying to build a global capability, and then you're trying to then sort of localize that. But the problem is we can't create global capabilities for all the markets that we have, right? There needs to be a very strong partnership between the global capabilities, or in this case, marketing and product, and our regional capabilities and our presence within the market, right? And so we have offices in very specific regions that are run by folks who are from those regions. And I think, just a very solid partnership with them would allow us to get there, right? And I think it's going to be very important. So the operational model is definitely a part of it. And I think, we're slowly getting there because I think we're sort of at a different phase at Spotify. But the other thing too is, again, these capabilities that we're building for global growth that we eventually will need to localize to some extent, right? That's kind of how we're kind of thinking about things.
Excellent. That sounds fantastic. So it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I'm going to bring this round to our last 5 questions, which is 5 quick fire questions. So number 1 is, what's your best piece of marketing advice?
I've been successful when there has been a very true understanding of how and why our users use our product and our service. Because I think that answer is really, it allows you to do 3 things, right? I mean, it allows you to sort of bridge the gap between sort of what's measurable and what's not, at least from the onset. It allows you to sort of optimize not just for the short term, but it gives you context to optimize for the long run. And then again, like global averages versus local optimization, right? I mean, I think if there's not this very fundamental understanding of how your users in very specific markets and different life stages are using your product, then you're going to be optimizing for the wrong thing. So I think just an understanding of your users will always be, I think for me, the truest constant within this changing landscape that we call technology, I guess.
I agree. I mean, I guess the way that you reach people can always change, but as long as you've got a really good handle on your customers, who they are and what they want and how you're solving that need for them, that's what's really important.
Yeah, I mean, the channels change, the tactics change, the product changes. If there is just persistent understanding of the sort of why your users are using your product and how they're using it and how it fits into their lives, that for me is always the starting point into trying to determine how to effectively market.
Absolutely. So number 2, can you recommend a book to our listeners?
Yeah, there was this one book that Reed asked his leads team to read, and it's called The Advantage by Patrick Moran. I was like, oh, you know what? Then I probably should read it. And it's been one of those things where it's been one of those books where I've actually come back to it a handful of times. And it's about organizational health and the importance of organizational alignment. And so that's sort of been quite important to me. So yeah, I mean, that's a book that I would recommend.
That's a great bit of insight as well as a book. It's a great bit of insight into, Reed Hastings and the culture at Netflix as well. So appreciate that. And for anybody listening, I'll put a link to that book on the show notes page, which you'll find at mattbyram.com as well. So number 3, what software tool could you not live without?
I guess the way that I also think about this question is the flip side to it, right? Is what software tool do I use every day to be productive? And so here at Spotify, we're a pretty big Google shop. So that's Gmail, Google Docs, Google Spreadsheet, Google Presentation, Google Drive, that and Slack. Yes, the two. Well, no, maybe three. That, Slack, and probably Trello. So
yeah.
those I couldn't live without.
All good software. We're big G Suite fans ourselves as well. So number 4 is, what's your favorite example of a marketing campaign?
I guess there's a lot of campaigns that I've been exposed to, but I guess what I could do is I could share with you my favorite campaign that I worked on. And I think that would have to be the first season of House of Cards. Oh, yeah, and it's because we did not know what we were doing. But I believe that was the campaign that forced us to ask questions around how we were going to do marketing, which I would like to believe is what led, or at least was the start of what led Netflix to have the marketing machine that it has today. Right. And it was what is the mix between brand and performance? How do we integrate with product? How does this integrate with own channels? Things of that nature. How do we do content marketing? Should we do content marketing versus feature marketing? I think a lot of those questions were asked when we were doing House of Cards. And I think just a lot of the stuff that we did, while it wasn't sort of world-class sexy, was certainly the fruit, I guess, or at least bore fruit into a lot of the things that Netflix does today.
And then I guess House of Cards really helped you see an explosion in how successful original content could be for Netflix.
Yeah, and it was pretty interesting because it took a while before that picked up traction. It wasn't immediate. So we launched it, I think, during Obama's inauguration in the first weekend of February. And we only really started to see traction in March and April. So there was a lot of, at least from my end, there was a lot of, was this working?
Yeah, bit of worry.
Is what we're doing worth it? So it was a great learning time, at least for me.
Amazing. And my final question of our last 5 is, which other podcasts do you listen to?
Yeah, so I listen to a lot of podcasts just because of the commute that I have. But I would say for this audience, I'd probably give 2. I think one is Masters of Scale by Reid Hoffman, and the other one would be Recode Decode by Kara Swisher. I think the folks that they interview and the discussions they have are very rich. And of course, those 2 fall under the Marketing Strategies podcast by Matt Byram. So I'll say that much.
I mean, it's a great third one. Thanks for picking it. No, the other 2 are fantastic. I have and do listen to both of those as well. So great choices. Well, Patrick, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on today. It's been lovely talking to you. Gained a bunch of insights. I know there's a ton more we could be speaking about, but it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on today. And I really appreciate your time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share with your friends. I'd also be extremely grateful if you could rate and review us on iTunes or the channel you get this podcast through. Until next time, I've been your host, Matt Byram.